Don't look for money, go get money. Looking for money is asking for money. Getting money is making money. Go get your cash to fund your dreams.
Well, welcome, Diamond Nation. Salem here. I'm here with my co host, Sel. Welcome you guys again to Africa's Diamonds, where we have conversations with African change makers. Our goal is to inspire you guys to bring change and building our continent. In Africa Diamonds, we believe that Africa's most precious resource is its people. Sel, how are you doing?
I'm doing well, Salem. I'm really excited about our guest today.
Indeed.
So, Diamond Nation, here's a scenario I want to paint for you. Let's say you're living out in the diaspora and you have a day where you're just feeling homesick and you want to go online and watch your favorite movie from Africa, right? You're Nigerian, you're Ghanaian, wherever you're from on the continent. You just want to go watch your favorite movie just to kind of get some restoration of memories, right?
Mm-hmm.
And what I do, Salem, is I go on YouTube and I go banging away on YouTube, scampering through to try to find my favorite movie. And most of the time, I'm disappointed. It's just the way it goes. And I have to live with it. I don't know what you guys do out there, Diamond Nation, but that's what I do. It doesn't work for me. Well, our guest today put some time and effort into solving that problem for you and I. And he and his co founder created a platform called Wabona. And Wabona essentially is an online subscription video streaming service that showcases African films and television shows. That's awesome. So instead of scampering through YouTube and getting disappointed, I could go straight to Wabona and get my fill of African content. And our guest today is none other than Simbarashe Mabasha. Simba, thank you so much for joining us. We're excited to hear your story.
Hey guys, thank you for having me.
Welcome on
Yeah,
the
man. So
platform.
what's new in your world, Simba?
Um, Great question. So clearly, I'm addicted to starting companies. So I've started another company, or in the process of starting a new media company, and focusing more on upstream, which means production.
Okay.
The companies I've built thus far has been doing distribution, but I think there is a massive shortfall of content, of high quality African content, and I want to get back into producing content, which is my passion, and building a media company that encompasses production with distribution at the bottom end, at the downstream side of it. So yeah, in the process of starting another company.
Wow, that is awesome. That is awesome. Well, Simbrashi, it seems like you're definitely somebody who like you talk about passion, and I think I want to give a chance to Domination to really know who is Simba. So speak a little bit on who is this person behind giving Africa this new voice of bringing African content. Who is Simba really?
Essentially, I think I'm a dreamer who was blessed with the the stubbornness to pursue dreams.
Okay.
Um, I come from a family of four. Grew up in the middle class, went to a private school, and my journey was somewhat interesting in that I got into the school I got into, which is one of the best schools in Zimbabwe where I grew up,
Mm.
because my baby sister got in, and he was very talented, such that they said bring the other kid. So so once I got into that space, I found it very liberating in terms of opportunities, and it really inspired me just to work better and harder. And the reality of smaller schools is that there's more contact time with teachers, there's
Right.
more extramural, so you're spending what 8 hours a day on campus. So it's a great opportunity for someone like myself who was very curious, who liked to do different types of things. So I found myself excelling in sports and drama, in debate and all those things. And but there was always a desire to do bigger things. I
Mm.
think from a young age, told I was very ambitious, so
Mm.
I always wanted to do big things. And when I was 15, I started my first company, well, my first venture. I don't think I registered it, and it was a neighborhood video club where we were just hustling videos for people at school, for people in the hood, and you were just solving a solution, making it convenient, cheaper for people to come down the road instead of going to the video club. You just come to my spot and we'll make a plan to get you some entertainment. So I've always been inspired by entertainment. And the seminal moment, the key moment, I think, was when I was 10, when I watched Steven Spielberg's Jurassic Park,
Mm.
Jurassic World last week, funny enough, and I think it's correct to say it's of all the sequels, it's the best one. But
Right.
what was important to me was the idea of imagination. And in Africa, we struggle at times with imagination
Yeah.
because our imagination is defined poverty, colonization, slavery, and race and culture, and it plays a big role in that curtailing imagination. And when I watched that film, what inspired me was how the mind knew no bounds, and these creative artists, found a way to put dinosaurs, until it's only 8 minutes. I mean, that movie is what it's 2 hours, but there's only 8 minutes of dinosaur time.
Mm.
But for me, that opened my world and blew my mind, and I was like, firstly, how can they do that? Secondly, how can I do that? So that was where my media passion began, and
Mm.
that's what inspires me. And watching Jurassic World last week, I teared up again because it was reinforcing the idea of imagination
Mm.
and that your dreams matter. As Lupita said at the Oscars, do not they matter? They are important. And for me, that's what I live by: is that your dreams matter, your imagination is crucial, and being curious is not a bad thing. I think sometimes Africans look down upon that, and purely because we're in a survival continent, we're trying to survive. So if you're being
Right.
curious and
Mm.
being imaginative, that costs time and money, and we don't have time and we have money. So ultimately, that's where I come from in terms of how I was built, how I was raised, and hope that makes sense.
It
That
does.
makes
It
a lot of
does.
sense.
And there's
Yeah.
something you said that I thought was very rich, and you talk about that how in Africa sometimes the affording to even having that sense of imagination is it costs time and money. I think that's really funny because it leads a little bit to my next question to you was what was kind of the biggest as you talked about at the age of 15 that you kind of started your first venture into the entrepreneurial type world. Would you say what was one of your biggest challenge at the beginning? Okay, for example, was it finding the support from the family? Was it just the fact that there wasn't something like what you wanted to do being done already? What was one of the first early challenges as you venture into something more professional? What was one of your biggest challenges?
I think the 15-year-old business, I think my parents thought that was a hobby. They
Okay.
didn't know that was me testing myself. So I found more challenges from them later when I became a professional.
Mm.
Actually, that business, the challenge actually was growing the market and meeting demand because you were solving a problem. Back in Harare, where I grew up, right in Zimbabwe, things were sparse, so you had to maybe take a taxi, take a car to go get entertainment.
Mm.
What I was saying for my immediate 1 to 5 kilometer radius was let me handle that. And because I went to a school where we could get stuff, people were importing, some of my mates were importing, they had wealthy cousins or they traveled a lot or had family members that were traveling, they could bring stuff quicker than the video clubs, right? So that was me solving that problem. It was it was a demand thing more than anything else. It couldn't scale because I couldn't necessarily dedicate enough time to it as I still went to school for 8 hours. Where I found the most resistance was after university. So I'm a lawyer by profession, right? And after that, I didn't want to practice law. I actually wanted to go to business school, and I couldn't get into business school, but I got into law school, funny enough, which is bizarre. But anyway, and the initial resistance was my family. Is that you are a lawyer, you are well educated. Why would you let these things go in pursuit of an entrepreneurial idea?
Yeah.
Not even a dream, an idea. And and there are two ways you can look at this. The first thing is they're trying to protect you, rightly so,
Right.
because they don't want you to fail, and they don't want you to lose. So your immediate resistance from your family is twofold: is out of protection, so you cannot hate on that. You have to understand where they're coming from.
Right.
Secondly, culture thing. They, because of our complicated history as Africans, right? The colonial generation had limited opportunities and options. So for someone like myself to now be given all these opportunities and options, to say no, I want to take another path is very difficult for people to comprehend. So
Right.
you find the elders in your family and your parents struggle because they couldn't have the opportunities that you're letting go of and you're saying no to. So they then fight and resist that because for them, they weren't afforded that level of imagination.
Mm.
Whereas I was now afforded, as being born post independence or in a new generation, I saw the world slightly bigger and I saw opportunities slightly more. So you find resistance, and as I said, it's a culture thing. The post-colonial generation is very different from the colonial generation
Right.
in that the opportunities are very, very different, and our mindsets are different. We are accused of being more arrogant, less patient, But this is what freedom does,
Mm.
at least in a
Hmm.
theoretical, the freedom to think, the freedom to say I can, whereas they weren't given those freedoms. So you find those types of resistances, and that's what I found. My biggest detractors at times were my people's closest to me,
Right.
understand so. And I think for anyone starting a business or venturing in a dream, right? You cannot take that too personally. It is very painful, but you actually have to understand where they are coming from and don't let that knock your hustle. Because if
That's
you see
good.
the world differently, it's okay. Because the greatest visionaries are called visionaries for a reason, because they see things differently.
That's real good. So you broke through that. You found a way, because I know a lot of people who are at that position you were at. If they're experiencing resistance or they have experienced resistance, and you broke through that, and I'm guessing this is where the founding story of Wabona comes in. So touch on how you break through that. How does someone in Diamond Nation break through that resistance? Because we're a culture that emphasizes obedience. We emphasize listening to your elders. We emphasize certain things that are not necessarily entrepreneurial all the time. And you broke through that and you founded a company, a successful one. So tell us that. How did you break through it, and maybe touch on the founding story of Wabona?
Okay. So I think initially you actually have to be mad. You
Mm.
actually have to be comfortable with being mad, being considered mad, and being lonely. I say those two things because being mad is doing things that people don't do or in that society and culture, and doing them over and over again. And for me, it was it was an issue of conviction in that. So I'm a Christian. I believe that these dreams are God given. These are gifts, and I believe that in pursuing them, you are in actual fact praising God. If life, to be philosophical, if the meaning of life is, for me, is praising God, do that with your gifts. You
Hmm.
know. So I found a few people that believed in me. So how I got to Wabona was an interesting journey. I started two companies. My first two companies were trade businesses. One was an FMCG business, and the other was minerals trade. That I started while I was my last year at university, at University of Cape Town in South Africa. And I realized that we couldn't find venture capital in Africa. And frankly, at the time, I wasn't really sure that people would believe in me enough to give me their cash, right?
Right.
So you have to generate cash. You know what I'm saying? You have to find another hustle. And I learned something that I tell a lot of entrepreneurs: do not, especially in our context, right? Do not depend too much on venture capital. Go
Mm.
make other capital to fund your business. So I started these two businesses to fund a company called African Dust Media Group, which is the majority shareholder of Wabona. And the idea was to build seed capital, right? And this was designed purely to meet the need of how do I fund my dreams, right? So you go into other established industries and you look for gaps. because I'm entrepreneurial, I had, other than video clubs, I used to buy and sell stuff at school. You always find opportunities in trade, and trade is the longest form of any entrepreneurial business in the world. You know, it's cemented in stock markets, it's cemented in retail businesses. Ultimately, it's trade. All we're trying to do is find something you need and you pay for it, right?
Right.
So I did that to fund African Dust, right? That didn't go too well, but I learned a lot. But in that process, I met my first investors.
Mm.
And those guys saw what I was doing, believed in what I was doing. And the founding idea for African Dust was telling African stories. Ultimately, we wanted to change the narrative of Africa, and for ourselves, not for the world, for ourselves. Purely because if you were to tune into TV or read newspapers or go online, the African narrative was poverty, genocide, war, and corruption, right?
Yep.
Bad leadership. That was the African narrative. And obviously, that affects the locals themselves. The people indigenous to this continent are affected severely by that, right? So for me, I didn't look at it in that way. I always looked at it as an opportunity, as a blessing. God didn't make a mistake when He made Africa, right?
Mm.
You know, and I was very stubborn in my thinking around that because I
Mm.
wasn't a mistake and our people weren't a mistake. We're all made in the image of God, which means we're a good thing, right?
Mm.
So I say to myself, we need to change the narrative of Africa, and that's by telling stories, but telling stories differently. Illuminating the success, like what you guys are doing, illuminating the struggles in a positive way, but illuminating the realities of Africa. It's not all doom and gloom. You know what I'm saying? It's not all madness. Yes, there is a lot, but
Yeah.
any society has this. And least we forget, post-colonial Africa is about 60 to 70 years old. We're a young continent
Right.
in terms of development. Some civilizations have been going through this for 500 to 1,000 years. So to put so much pressure on ourselves made no sense to me. So I found people that believed in that agenda, in that vision. And they put money down and we built African Dust. Initially, we were going to tell stories, but we we found resistance in South Africa because our market is pretty much built on oligarchs, so it's very difficult to get in. And
Mm.
people want to give us an opportunity to tell our stories or let us keep our stories, right? I'm a businessman, man. So I'm a businessman first. I'm not going to tell and give you and then you make money off it in the back end. The
Mm.
back end is your, I'm saying. So I was like, nah, I've got to keep some of the back end. It makes no sense for me not to keep some of the back end. But that was not the way things happened here. So
Mm.
at the national broadcaster here, the SABC, was going through some struggles, and that was the biggest media employer in the country. At the same time, Netflix was blowing up in the States, right?
Right.
And we saw, okay, and the internet was getting better or was going to get better, you know. So we said, okay, cool. We're going to build a distribution business, a video on demand business. We're calling it Wabona, and we're going to focus on telling African stories, but we're going to retool our message and focus on the diaspora at first, purely because the internet was there. Netflix was establishing a market. Payment gateways were built, and people were comfortable using credit cards and debit cards online. All these things weren't in Africa, so we couldn't do it here. And also send a shout out to Iroko, Jason's company, because they were doing this on YouTube too. And
Mm.
we all started at the same time. We were just the first ones to build a platform. They had built their business on YouTube, through Yoruba Lab and those types of businesses. So things were changing. And Nollywood was fast becoming a powerhouse of production, with
Hmm.
varying, of course, but they were proving a model. Africans want to watch African content.
Right.
And Nollywood did that. And Nollywood proved that model. And now we need to build on that by changing qualities and changing the narrative of the story. So we built what wanted to service the diaspora, to give them, to tell these stories. Because we were Zimbabweans living in South Africa. We also missed our own entertainment, right? So we wanted to build something that did that. Not only for us, but for people worldwide, right? So that's how we got to Wabona.
Yeah, wow. So, that's an incredible story. I believe You talked about Iroku there a little bit. I believe there's a lot of effort to change that narrative. I have an interesting question that I think Diamond Nation would be curious to know. At the height of Wabona, what were your revenues? What kind of success did you guys see?
We saw uptake. So that's a good question. We in the diaspora, getting to market was tough because you had to put a lot of money down for marketing spend, right? But so we made another key decision. We're going to take a gamble and focus on the continent in part and build a mobile centric business. And with that mobile centric business, we were able to start delivering our content in bite sized chunks on over 3,000 feature phones and smartphones, the smartphone app. And we saw traction. We did 45,000 downloads in 5 days.
Mm,
We're peaking at 475,000 members of our community. So we did really, really big numbers. We don't speak to revenue publicly,
Okay.
but we are a growing business. We're a business that's looking to grow. So we found what we proved was demand. There is a market. Now the issue is, will the market pay?
right.
And that's the problem many of us are trying to solve. Iroko Buni and there are many other people who are trying to do this. I believe there is a price point for this marketplace. I believe there is a subscription model for this African marketplace. I think the ex-African marketplace, well, there is a price point. That's between $5.99 to $10.99. Anywhere in that Netflix Hulu range, I think people will pay. People are comfortable with that. It's our context where we have data challenges, device challenges, and payment gateway challenges. That's where we find where we need innovation for VOD to pick up in this continent, in particular mobile video on demand.
Wow. And I think you spoke on that a little bit when you talked about that there is like you said, a price point that Africans are willing, even those in the diaspora, are willing to pay for African content. My question is a little bit of, do you believe as the rise of other entrepreneurs in more of the tech world will make that more how can I say it? Will make it more easier for people within your field of the entertainment and the media to bring this content more accessible to people for to pay for. For example, if your internet is not working really well, it's hard for you to pay for a movie that is going to take hours to download. You know what I mean?
It's absolutely imperative that entrepreneurs solve these problems.
Mm,
And it's not only for entertainment, but it's for society as a whole. It's in society.
right.
It's in developing countries get greater interest. We solve data compression, payment gateways.
Mm,
We solve those are the key fundamentals in our context. In terms of data, how do we stream it? Where from? If we're dominated by telcos or mobile network operators who are very demanding, and I dare say, somewhat backward in their thinking on this matter,
mm,
how then does someone have to, because he still has to pay for his data, right? He still has to pay $1 to $5 for data. And that data is not only for you as an entertainer, it's for his Facebook, his WhatsApp, his general surfing and his banking and his M health, right? So you're competing for $5 to $10 at a time as an entertainment organization, right, or company.
mm.
So whoever makes that process better in terms of compression, that you can get more bang for your dollar, helps. Secondly, it's payments. M-Pesa in Kenya has been a groundbreaking, and I'll go as far as one of the most important technological advances in African history is M-Pesa, purely because it managed to bridge the gap of old and new. Imagine a reality where your grandmother in a rural area is comfortable receiving money via SMS.
Mm.
That the mind shift changed. The shift it did, it forced upon Kenyan people was phenomenal, and that's an example of Africans being forced to change with the times and being willing to change with the times, right?
Right.
So M-Pesa changed the way people viewed money and banking. And a significant part of the Kenyan economy runs through mobile money. The same thing is happening in Zimbabwe. The same thing is happening in other countries where mobile payments have become part and parcel of the banking and the money transfer infrastructure in the continent. That's a key development. That's a key technological jump. Just like Africa jumped landlines into mobiles, we potentially are jumping banking and going using mobile to do that, right?
Wow.
He who creates a platform that can handle multiple mobile money wallets, multiple mobile money systems that is pan-African wins the game, because then not only entertainers, retailers, businesses that need money transfer to pay their employees, yada yada yada, cannot get on this platform and just use it as an interchange.
Right.
You're using Tigo Cash and you want to pay in M-Pesa, or you're using Echo Cash and you want to pay through MTN Money, right?
Mm-hmm.
He who can fix that problem solves a big problem. And that's a groundbreaking problem, because you're getting multiple backends to speak, which is difficult, at a first. But secondly, you're making it agnostic. You're making mobile money agnostic, like credit cards and debit cards, yada, yada, yada. And that's really important, right? So whoever can solve those two things not only helps media companies, but helps society as a whole.
Yeah, that's an interesting problem you bring up, and we want to get into some of the more social problems. But just to keep that conversation going here, what role do you think Western there's a lot of innovation in the Western world around this mobile money issue. There's a lot of stuff like that going on. I know Snapchat, for example, which is a popular messaging app, has a feature where you can send resources, money across the board. I think Facebook is developing something like that. How are those technologies that currently exist in the Western world, how are they going to help us on the continent as we're building our businesses and as we try? We need this infrastructure in place.
I think we're ahead of the curve there. I think Africans have been dealing with mobile money they're deeper developed than Western countries. I think Western countries are actually catching up to us. We via feature phone. So in the West, we're predominantly working within the smartphone ecosystem. Feature phones are less dumb. They're dumber than smartphones, but they're better than the original cell phone, right?
Mm-hmm.
So via SSD, we've been doing payment at least for 7 years now. Snapchat, I think Facebook have just launched their service. Snapchat is new. Link in Asia, I think, is also new. There may be 2 or 3 years. We've been having it in our context. It's just that it's been transferred from a feature phone to a smartphone or to a desktop. The key is we need to continue innovating, because we are leading the market in this. Because the world, right? If you look at it, Africa is has the youngest population under 25 in the world. It's still building its middle class. It's still building its infrastructure. To put it simply, this is the last bastion of capitalism is Africa.
Right.
This is where capitalism it's still got 50 to 100 years of work to do. Then Southeast Asia, and then parts of South America. The West is done. It's matured. It's in some respects it's regressing. Yes, they'll have all the cash. There's no doubt about that. But in terms of market growth and opportunities, we Africa have the opportunity, because we have the youngest population in the world.
Right.
So we are actually leading Facebook, Snapchat, WhatsApp. We are at the core face of innovation around solving these problems. And these problems are actually very important, because if someone doesn't necessarily have a Wi-Fi solution, which obviously are now becoming ubiquitous in the West, and needs to work on a network backend, and you have a payment platform that allows for that, it actually makes it can take you to a rudimentary, a very basic level of making payments. Obviously, there is a top level which we're already dealing with now, but at the bottom level, we are solving that problem, and we are still we may actually never need credit cards or debit cards in our context at that level, because mobile money may jump that step. Obviously, Amex and Visa won't want to hear that, but I think if if they're not looking at mobile money in that way, it's potentially a threat
Mm.
because its penetration is so big. We have what 650 million cell phones in the continent. We'll hit a billion end of this year, early next year. So we have such market capitalization, such market size and scope that many companies just don't have, and that's where we are innovating and getting better. The
Mm.
problem ever is governments have to come, and they are coming online. The Kenyan government has started taxing M-Pesa, which makes sense because it's a good revenue spinner. They have to encourage, penetration of mobile money. We have to now looking at modern banking or old school banking tools. How do we modernize them in mobile money? How do we do insurance? That's happening in Kenya. How do we do healthcare payments? All those. How do we pay people via mobile money? Those are the things where the state has to step in. People have to increase the amount of internet penetration on the continent. That internet is a human right now. It's fundamental to society's evolution and development. There has to be internet. That's not a state issue. The government has to make that process easier. African governments have to come to the party on that. So I think to reconfigure your question, how can the West learn from us?
Mm.
And I think the key learnings are about we are an adaptive population. Mobile money helps us get to market quickly, and people are comfortable with making payments on mobile money as people are comfortable making payments by credit card and debit card. So WhatsApp, WeChat, Facebook they have to integrate mobile money into their platforms for them to find better success in the continent.
Right. So if they're trying to get into Africa and most of the developing world, actually, underdeveloped to developing world, yeah, I think we completely agree with your perspective on that. And I'm glad you're bringing this up for Diamond Nation because there's a lot of you guys out there, Diamond Nation. You have ideas and you're living in a diaspora. You're in the United States. You're in Europe, and you're trying to build them up over here in in the West. And what Simba just told you was you're in the wrong place. You've got the connections to where it's happening. So Simba, here's a question to follow up on that, and then we'll get into some social issues here. Why is it difficult to get funding in Africa? You've made a clear point that if you're an investor, if you're a venture capitalist, if you're an angel investor, and you really want your money to change something large in the world, you don't keep it in the West. Why is it difficult to raise
It's a
funds on the continent?
I think my answer is twofold. It's a perceptions thing. We don't trust Africans. It's a self-perpetuating prophecy that comes from colonial times that we
Right.
can't trust banks. So we can't trust them with their money, and if we're going to give them money, we have to put ridiculous conditions. I mean, I've taken money from VC. I mean, it's ridiculous. Let's give you an example. Twitter
Mm.
and Facebook weren't profitable for a long time, but they were taking billions of dollars in VC
Mm-hmm.
funding, billions,
Mm.
and their valuations were nuts, based on sometimes phantom user bases, African companies, same upside, and you're asking maybe for $5 million at most. The conditions for you to get that cash is madness,
Mm.
absolute madness. There is a perception that we can't be trusted with cash, that we actually don't know what we're doing, um, and we're foolish and we're children. There is a paternal money is very paternal, and that no,
Mm-hmm.
we need to guide these kids, these African children who are aid driven, aid based, always asking for things. We need to put them on a leash and bring them along into the 21st century. The reality, if you look at microfinance as an example, there are companies in this continent that have 90% repayment microfinance, in the
Wow.
informal economy. Purely because people understand that if I don't pay you back, I'm not going to get more money. We're not stupid. And I need more money to grow my opportunity, right? It's all about social contracts. Is that if I say I'm going to give you $10 and you need $10 to make 12 and you're going to give me $11 back, right? I have to trust you, and you have to trust me to allow you to do your hustle, and you're gonna pay me back my $11. I make $1 more,
Mm-hmm.
and you make $1. You know what I mean? So there is that issue, a colonial based perception where money looks at us in such a way that it doesn't trust us.
Mm.
The second thing would be we actually don't trust ourselves. And we are enamored by the valley, Silicon Valley that is, we're enamored by, all these, especially in tech entrepreneurship, the sexy, valuations, the sexy ecosystems. We went to Silicon Valley when we got our first round of funding. They didn't know where Africa was, to be honest with you. Like, oh, y'all have internet. Oh wow, that's amazing.
Wow.
Not gives you cash. You know what I mean? And and the lesson for me was that, what, let's trust ourselves.
Mm.
Let's our hustle. Let's go into parts of the economy that are still growing with better numbers than tech. Manufacturing, primary trade, all those industries, other service industries. Let's trust our hustle enough to raise our own capital. And that means you reconfiguring your mindset as an entrepreneur and saying, yes, I'm tech heavy or tech biased, but I still have the insight, the entrepreneurial insight, which are fundamental across all industries, that I can go make a dollar there that can fund this business. And this I think is where people need to, your audience should shift their mindset. Don't look for money, go get money.
Mm. Mm.
That's different. Asking for money is asking for money. Getting money is making money. Go get your cash to fund your dreams. Because if you spend 2, 3 years just saying, no, I'm doing pitch decks, I'm doing valuations, you're always just chasing cash, and it's not coming because they're telling you don't really know this marketplace. They're looking at it from a European or a Western vantage point. Their paradigms are different. It'll be a waste of time. If you can say, no, I've got 50% of the cash I have, plus my sweat equity, just give me 30% to keep it moving. You know what I'm saying? Or give me working capital. Let's do a working capital deal. You know what I'm saying? I'll use equity as surety.
Mm.
You know what I'm saying? Innovate in how you get cash. This is a tough environment. This is a very, very difficult environment. Venture capital, angel investment, it's if it's Western based, in some respects Eastern, if its paradigm is colonial, don't ask for cash. If it's a diaspora driven venture capital firm or angel investor firm that is cognizant of the realities and that can trust the entrepreneur. Money should trust the entrepreneur, because at the end of the day, he's taking the biggest risk. He doesn't have, potentially he's putting his house on mortgage, or he doesn't have a salary, he may have kids. He's taking the biggest risk by asking you for cash. The fact that you can afford to give him cash means you're fine.
Right. Right.
You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So if it is diaspora based money that understand the context, and allows the entrepreneur to fly, take that cash. But don't be afraid to say no.
Hmm. Hmm.
Don't be afraid to say no. Look for other hustles. You know what I'm
Wow.
saying? If you can find a consultancy gig that pays your rent, yeah, and you can hustle at night, do it. Because some of the best dudes didn't have money to make, didn't have money to get. They made their own money.
Right.
Hmm. You spoke on very sensitive issues, the relationship that is with Africa and the diaspora and the Western world. You spoke on the issue of like the colonial issue that happens with that. I want to speak a little bit as we transition in more into social issues, because more than just being a businessman, you also are a big advocate, a big voice for a lot of different social issues. And just to kind of speak to a little bit of Diamond Nation and some of our other audiences throughout the world, you've done some stuff in terms of race relation, and I kind of want you to speak a little bit on that, because I know you did some work with the Sri Lanka Unites and things like that. You even wrote a book. To speak a little bit of what is Simba's heart when it comes to these type of race related issue dealing with Africa.
All right, man. I think there was one person who said it on what's the guy who replaced the Colbert Show, um, former Daily Show correspondent. What's his name?
Um, Stewart,
Very funny guy. Not the one after the nightly news, the nightly show. What's that dude's name, man? Anyway, he had a show in February where he had panelists. The first panelist was black man, black African American man. Second panelist was black African American woman. And there was a woman who
Right.
comes out and she said, "I'm unapologetically for black people.
Mm.
I am also unapologetically for black people."
Right.
So what does that
Right.
mean? That's not a racist thing. That's saying that being pro-black isn't anti-white.
Mm.
Being
Right.
pro-black is saying that we, as black people, as African people, in light of our 500 to 700 years of a complicated, painful history, have to now put in new infrastructure, emotional, social, physical, mental, economic infrastructure to move forward, to deal with the traumas of our past that are very much evident in our countries. On a daily basis, you see them. We may be free, we may be independent in most of the 50 plus states in this continent,
Mm.
but the vestiges are there of language, of economic system, political systems that are imports of our colonial history. So, or our slave history, or our
Mm.
apartheid history. We need to start putting things in place that obviously deal with that, but also build us forward. So that is to say, we need to put our history in context. It shouldn't be um, our chain, because history can be a chain, in that it can be a slave chain, it can be a ball and chain, because you now blame your past on your lack of success. But we also need to acknowledge that the past played a role to get us here. There are, in South Africa in particular, apartheid was a very efficient system that will be alive in a post-democratic South Africa for at least 100, 150 years, because it was so successful in creating physical infrastructure that divide black and white. Infrastructure that make education, a luxury for black people. Something that will always affect this economy is, the lack of skilled black people. And that's an apartheid reality. In some economies, they've handled better than others. Zimbabwe is a well-educated economy, so they've handled that very well. Some others haven't. So we need to put in place infrastructure, emotional and mental, physical, economic infrastructure to redress these issues. So part of that process is speaking the racial history we have. Part of that process is investing in ourselves, so such that we can then build out new businesses that are aware of where they're coming from, but are not limited by where they're coming from.
Mm.
So when I speak on race matters, and I've had the pleasure of speaking in Sri Lanka, in South Africa, on these matters, it's to redress some fundamental failings in the race narrative. And part of that is saying that, no, it's okay, you're free now, your pain is gone. It's rubbish. Pain lingers forever. There are social genetics of pain. There are some societies that are going through post-traumatic stress based on race. African societies are pretty much all still dealing with those realities, right?
Mm.
But it doesn't mean you cannot succeed. It doesn't mean when your parents say, we can't afford you to be imaginative or to dream of your business, that you can't do that. They're coming from a different culture that needs to deal with their problems, deal with their situation, and be allowed to do that. But you, as a young African, have to say that, no, I get where you're coming from, but I'm going to do things differently.
Mm.
And the race, the colonial, the slave, the apartheid narrative is still a big part of how we view ourselves and how we deal with that. And I try to say, let's look at it differently, let's acknowledge it, but let it not be a hindrance for progress and development. Because we are unique in that we're probably the largest conquered continent in the world. I don't think not even maybe Genghis Khan can be comparable in old China, Mongolia. He conquered a vast space of land. Africa must be number two,
Mm.
or number one. So we have to deal with a lot of that baggage. And for us to do that, we need leaders, risk takers, thinkers, philosophers business people to acknowledge this reality, put things in place to change this reality, invest in ourselves, invest differently in ourselves, be comfortable investing in cultural things that celebrate pre-colonial culture, colonial and post-colonial culture. African art, African history. I mean, the things Africans have done, prior to the colonial narrative, are seemingly forgotten, but are phenomenal.
Mm.
Africa was the breadbasket of the Roman Empire. Timbuktu was where Islam was put into books.
Mm-hmm.
So in Zimbabwe, Great Zimbabwe, they smelted gold 300 years before Europeans.
Mm-hmm.
They were building structures way before Europeans. So to now say that we can't do these things, is a great tragedy and a great disrespect to our rich history.
Right.
Even with colonialization and slavery and apartheid.
Hmm.
So for me, it's changing our mindset, being part of the change mindset. As Biko talked about, and I write what I like, how once you change your mind, you can see the world differently. And for entrepreneurs, once you change your mind, you can see opportunities differently.
Right. Hmm.
So that's just, oh my gosh, that's a sound bite if I've ever heard any. That was awesome. Diamond Nation, take notes. That's changing the conversation, changing your perspective, changes the continent. That's just awesome stuff. And I would go on to maybe I this might be where you're going with your new venture, your new startup in the media world. Is this some of the content you're going to be creating? Is it around this, changing the narrative, changing the conversation?
That's exactly it, man. That's all I want to do.
That's awesome.
I tell different types of stories. I want to tell stories in the States, in Brazil, in the Caribbean, but that's part and parcel is changing the way we view ourselves. That's what I'm trying to do.
Right. Okay. So here's a question for you. I think Salem has it. Salem, you go ahead and ask this question. I think Simba is gonna love this one.
So Simba, as we're kind of discussing and thinking about some of the passion and the inspiration that you had, all right. So we were thinking, okay, hypothetically speaking, this is just a hypothetical question that could be come true. Who knows? But if you had the opportunity, okay, to work with Steven Spielberg, let's say if Steven Spielberg asked you to work on a project with him, and he asked you that you had the freedom to come up with the concept. That there was no financial limits, so money wasn't an issue. What would you feature on the project?
I've already got a project for you, man. So y'all reading my mind.
That's awesome.
I think the project would look at Southern African empires. So the predominant narrative is the Zulu nation. The Shaka Zulu narrative as the biggest or baddest Southern African empire. We can't actually call the Zulus an empire, but anyway, and this is offensive, potentially offensive, because it wasn't cross border and it wasn't that big. It encompassed the KwaZulu Natal and Eastern Cape, right? Yeah, but there were other empires. There was the Mutapa Empire, there was the Kami Empire, there was the Great Zimbabwean empires, right?
Mm-hmm.
We haven't had an adventure story that looks at Africa the way the Roman narrative is played through, or the narrative in Game of Thrones or Lord of the Rings, where you have imperial vestiges, in Western societies. We haven't told an imperial African narrative, and that is something that I think Spielberg would be interested in, if I may speak for himself, for for him, in terms of big budget, huge CG, massive sets, 3 or 4 locations in Southern Africa. That's something I hope he would be interested in for DreamWorks.
Yeah.
But I'll give him a shot. I'll tell him this is what he should do, and then
Exactly.
he'll say.
Diamond Nation, if you know Steven Spielberg, or if you are Steven Spielberg listening in here, that's for you. We got to
Exactly.
get this
That's right.
thing done. That's a great idea. We got to get it done.
That was awesome.
So let's put our social capital, our networking capital to
Exactly.
work, and let's get it done.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
Right.
That's
Look, I'm
awesome.
on Facebook.
Yeah, so Simba, we're getting to the end of our interview here. I got a couple closing questions for you. This was absolutely phenomenal. Thank you so much for coming on and
Thank
doing
you. It was
this.
awesome.
It's just absolutely phenomenal. And so we like to ask all our entrepreneurs who come on to share some resources, books, uh, reading material other than books, whatever resources you think would benefit Diamond Nation in their journey to be change makers for our continent. So, what resources can you suggest to us? 3 books, videos, whatever, movies.
Okay, I'll suggest a lot. So let's start with books.
All right.
Marcus Garvey's biography by an Englishman, I forgot his name, is a phenomenal book. It's a really long book, but it's one of the most important books because Marcus Garvey was probably one of the first black people to build a multinational company. And how he went about that is phenomenal because the Black Star movement was to move African Americans back to Africa, but he had to
Mm.
build a business. He had to buy ships. He had to offer stocks and things of that nature. This was in a very difficult time. In some areas of America, slavery was still alive and well. So, and he was a Jamaican who managed to do this. A dark-skinned Jamaican, which is important because the internal race politics in amongst African peoples also complicates matters,
Mm.
and he managed to do something very interesting. So his biography is a very good. It's called Negro in a Hat.
Okay.
Um,
Mm.
Malcolm Gladwell, I think there are 2 books. Well, yeah, 3 books actually from Malcolm that I really like. He is controversial in some respects, but there are things an analytical eye can learn from and observe in some of his stories. The Tipping Point, Outliers, and David and Goliath.
Great
Mm.
books.
A
Great
books
books.
give you interesting insight into how normal people became extraordinary, and how they went, or how societies can change by changing certain things, either aesthetically or internally, that help people think differently. And I think his whole narrative is look at things differently. Steve Jobs' biography, I think, is phenomenal. Now, he comes from a very unique context, so it's important to understand that when you read that from an African perspective. But the
Mhm.
things you pick up are determination, stubbornness, visionary thinking, and never giving up. And his story is that, and being difficult in a positive way because he wasn't the greatest guy, But I think the things he did were phenomenal, and I think his commencement speech at Stanford is a phenomenal resource to listen to have in your life narrative. Is that commencement speech because what he talks about is what every entrepreneur needs to hear. In terms of films, I think Spike Lee's Malcolm X is a phenomenal
Mm.
exposition of a man's life.
Mm.
A man who went through so much change so quickly, but had so much impact. And even the book, I think Haley wrote the biography, um, is phenomenal in terms of just giving people insight of what it takes to run an organization, to build social change, and to fight and to die for it.
Mm.
So I love that film. The book is phenomenal. Um, I thought Ava DuVernay's Selma was really good as a new to look at Martin Luther King differently. But
Mm-hmm.
I would actually recommend a book by Travis. Travis, who works at PBS. He has a book called Death of a King: The Last Year of Martin Luther King's Life, and that book gives you some interesting insight about a man who started his movement at a very different place to where it was ending, how he was radicalizing more, how he was understanding social issues outside race more. Um, excuse me. It's a great insight, a great resource in terms of when you in your vision building or in your pursuit of a dream. Sometimes you have to pivot.
Mm.
Mhm.
Sometimes you have to pivot the way you think. And how do you do that? These guys were doing it in a social national context. How do you do that personally? How do you do that in your community? How do you change your mindset? How do you work with your enemies If you're in Rwanda, Hutu Tutsi, if you're in Kenya and there are tribal issues, how do you deal with that?
Mm,
South Africa, race, tribe issues. And some of these resources help you at least get some insight from some very interesting people
right,
who are dealing with it at a big level.
right.
Steve Biko's I Write What I Like is a phenomenal resource in terms of mindset from people who are dealing with colonial and slavery and apartheid issues. It's a book about confidence, believing in yourself as a black person. I highly recommend that. Um, what else?
And for Diamond Nation, we're gonna have all these resources listed, so you don't have to
Exactly.
worry about
Just
remembering them. We're gonna have them all listed for you. So
And in terms of just blogs, magazines, the New York Times Biz blog is fantastic. That's a tech blog that the New York Times runs. Um, Fortune magazine is phenomenal.
mm,
I read that somewhat religiously because they have some really great stories about different types of
mm,
entrepreneurs. There isn't enough in terms of African resources, but I think if you look at the Roots, the Roots blog, in terms of like African stories, that helps. What else can you read? What else? There isn't enough happening. I mean, there are blogs like Tech Zim that look at Zim technology. There's some Kenyan blogs that
mm-hmm.
look at technology in that respect, but they are not. Unfortunately, they're still developing and growing, and I think they need investment, not only financial but creative investment, in terms of how best to make these things look.
Mm,
And finally, I think to speak to where we are going in terms of entertainment, I'd recommend a YouTube channel um, called Can See Me Ann. It's a Ugandan comedian who has built up 220,000 subscribers with bite-sized comedy clips about her context
wow.
that have become viral. Um, and why I say this is that's people taking risks, people finding their own cameras, their own sound equipment, editing equipment, and telling stories in their context.
Mm,
Mm.
This is where we're going. This is my life narrative, my life journey. And that's just a small example of where the continent is going in terms of creativity and media. So I highly recommend that. It's very funny. It's very crazy, silly, but it's very transferable in the African experience.
Wow, wow.
awesome.
Well, Simba, we were absolutely blessed. I mean, I think Diamond Nation, if I can speak on behalf of everyone at Diamond Nation, it was definitely a pleasure having you on. So much content. I think that's something that we can say there was definitely a lot of valuable, rich content. The
Yep.
conversation today was definitely something that we treasured. So thank you. Thank you for being
So much.
um,
Thanks for having me.
for coming on Africa's Diamond. So, ladies and gentlemen, wherever you might be in the world listening to Africa's Diamonds, we want you to know that go after your dreams. As you heard from one of our founders and entrepreneurs featured today, we want you to believe in your dreams. We want you to believe in a little bit of that stubbornness, as Simba talked about, that sometimes you may not always have it as you want. You may not always have it as you hoped it would be, but be persistent. Learn your history, know where you come from, and go after your dream. So, on behalf of Africa's Diamond, it was Salem and Sale here saying thank you for listening in. We'll talk to you guys next time. See you guys.